Well, welcome to Impact Moment. I am Pastor Donna, and I am from Impact Church in Aurora, South Dakota. And today we are starting our brand new Lenten book study. And if you haven't gotten this book already, you can find it actually on Cokesbury.com or Amazon.com. And the book is Surprise the World by Michael Frost. So be sure to pick up that book, but I do know, if you don't want to, that's totally fine too, because you can totally follow along and watch this awesome study without the book. But I do want you to know, like, it's really inexpensive. It's around $8, and it's a really quick read. And so we're going to cover this over 8 weeks. So it should take us up to close to Easter. So we are diving into the very, very first chapter. And really, this book is so interesting because it's going to be talking about ways that you can enter into a missional type ministry, no matter if you're a pastor or not. And so we all have a responsibility to have a missional Christian mindset. And what does that look like? What does that look like for pastors, and what does that look like for people within our congregations? So, and the first chapter today, we talk about the E word, and it's evangelism. So, and I always want to preface, when we use the word evangelism, sometimes it can be a word that us churchy people want to avoid, just because some of the connotation that we have with the word evangelism is those TV preachers that seem to be in it just for the money. There are some really, really good TV preachers out there, but then we all know that there are some that, I think their priorities, might be a little bit skewed. But so we're not really talking about those type of evangelists, but more in the regards of being a missional church and being a missional minded person. How can we do outreach within our communities? And how can we really set the tone to let everyone know that we are Christians? And why do we want to be Christians? So I don't want you to be too turned off by the word evangelism, because it's really not the connotation that we're going for in this study. So evangelism really equals missional work. So let's get started then. Okay. All right. So we are really kind of diving in right away. And I was so pleased because there's a very short introduction, but within just the first couple of pages, I did want to mark some really cool things that came out from this author. And he really hits the nail on the head. And we are on page 2 if you are following along. So really, we talk about evangelism and what does it mean, and are we all supposed to be evangelists? And really, the author says it's really kind of unfair to say that all of us need to be evangelists, and that there's actually more than one type of evangelist. And so really knowing what type of evangelist that we are can really help us address being an evangelist. So it's going to look a little bit different for different people. So we'll get into that. But the author actually talks about the Apostle Paul talking about the different types of evangelism and how do we handle this biblical model set forth from Paul, and that we see actually Peter agree with Paul in his writings too. So with Paul, he really assumes a twofold approach to evangelism. And first, he affirms that the gifting of the evangelist, now note the gifting of the evangelist, so the person, not the idea of evangelism. Okay? So we're really talking about the evangelist. Him or herself is the gift. Okay? So, and if you want to read more into what he talks about with the evangelist, that is going to be found in Ephesians 4, chapter 4, verse 11. So then second, Paul writes, as though all believers were to be evangelistic in their general orientation. But he clearly places himself in this first category. Seeing his ministry is not only of that as the Apostle Paul that we all know him to be, but also to be an evangelist. So he gives himself clearly that title and says that that is the work that he is called to do. But it does not appear at all that Paul believes that all Christians are called to be evangelists. So, what does that mean? Well, first of all, he writes that we are to devote ourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And that is the key part of our jobs as missional workers and Christians, that we are not to be that bold proclamation evangelist that we see on TV, but we as evangelists can be more devoted to a prayerful life and be watchful and thankful for opportunities within our own lives to share our own God stories. And it says, and to pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And so we find this reading from Paul in Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. So I invite you to definitely read that section again. So this really gives us a sort of a model to follow from Paul as to what do we do if we're not in active ministry as pastors or lay pastors. What can we do outside of that? And it says, devote yourselves to prayer, be watchful and thankful. So basically 2 or 3 different steps here to follow. Easy. So then we get into kind of a different type of listing out of the different type of evangelists that's given by Paul. And so he really lists it out by 2 different types of evangelist. So the first one is that we have the gifted evangelist. And basically those priorities is that they have a calling to clarify what is in the gospel and to be that bold leader that we see in churches as pastors or lay pastors, youth pastors, those type of things. So that's what he refers to as gifted evangelists. But then we also have the evangelistic believers, okay? And that's kind of where the rest of us kind of fall into. And what does that mean? Well, that means that we have the priority of prayer, watchfulness, even wise socializing. And that type of ministry is there so that we can answer people when they have questions about our own faith. Why are you a Christian? Why do you want to have faith in God? And who is this Jesus? And so we can really utilize our own God stories to answer these questions. But we always, the first step for really anything as a Christian is to be devoted in prayer. And how do we watch and listen for those opportunities to really share our God stories with other people? And I think what is key here is that we need to be careful not to beat our message into somebody, because then they really don't want to listen to it. But if they ask you questions, feel free to answer them. But answer them wisely and relate to them with your own stories. I think people get a lot out of our own stories because it shows that we are just like them. And even though they might not be Christians, we can still all come together because we are people. And we have very much the same experiences throughout our lives. And that really binds us. And how can we show them what our lives how our lives are enriched by being a Christian? On the flip side, does that really mean that being a Christian makes us have no trials, no struggles? Everything is happy every single day? Of course not. But how do we handle those trials and struggles head on being a Christian? What does that look like? So we do have some really important opportunities here. But then we see Peter really take on what Paul was preaching, and he agreed with it. And he said, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 through 16, Peter says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." So basically, what he is saying here is that we need to follow this biblical mode that Paul has put forth. So, for the gifted evangelists, the pastors of all different kinds, whether you're a main pastor, youth pastor, or even a lay pastor, those are leaders, and those are to be equipped to lead and to identify and mobilize people that are going to be gifted evangelists. And within our Methodist tradition, we are called to go to preach. And so we call this, within our own religion, being itinerant. So that means that our conference really chooses where we go. And they listen to the Holy Spirit on where they place us, when they place us. And we are called to go. And that is our calling as these gifted evangelists. But then Peter also writes that the rest of us are really to live questionable lives. So what does that mean? To live a questionable life. So it's not really what you might think it is, but it's actually for good. So there's a song that most of us Christians, if we've always grown up in Sunday school in that type, we've grown up with a song that says we should know that we are Christians by our love. And we really need to emulate that throughout our life, that anyone that really experiences us and works with us, that they should know that we are Christians by our acts of love toward others. And that's kind of hard to always be loving towards everyone, but that is our goal that we should strive for, because it all goes back to Jesus' covenant. And he really wants us to love our neighbors as ourselves. That's the greatest commandment of all, and that is the one that we should always try to uphold. Jesus never said, though, that that would be an easy thing to do. But it takes practice. Anything that is worthwhile, it takes practice. I think of my piano students that I teach. You know, if they weren't practicing weekly, then they would never advance into their piano playing skills. And anything that is worthwhile is really worth putting the time and the energy in to master. And most of my piano students, they're taking piano because they want to normally learn how to play guitar later or play the drums later. And really, piano is a really good starting point for them to get into learning how to read notes, how to keep rhythm, and all of that. So, and it's really interesting because I do see some students that put all of their effort in, and you can tell that they do it almost daily what they're practicing, and it shows, because then I can notice the students that haven't touched a piano since the last time we met, and they haven't advanced really at all. So that goes with everything with life, and I think that goes into being a Christian too, and the things that we see that are commandments. It takes practice, a lot of practice, and being intentional daily. So we have that questionable lives, and what that really means too is that people can ask, gosh, we've seen you go through a lot, but you are still very, very faithful, and you're still a Christian. And tell me more. People are always curious as to the hope in the way that we live through Christ. And I have to reflect back on a time that we were really in the last week of my husband's cancer journey. And we had his friends from college come over, and we were all sitting in our living room. And one of his friends had literally asked me, well, how is it that both of you can be so calm during this time, knowing that there is no cure for this cancer and that he will be dying really, really soon? And we both really had to show these people, we are Christians. We know that this is not the end. Might be the end of Jeff's earthly time with us, but we know that heaven is really the eternal reward. And we know that that's where Jeff is right now. And that gives us hope, and it allows us to have calm and be able to accept the reality of what it was during that time. And really it was so eye-opening to have that question be asked, because I realized that my own attitude towards things is being watched by others. And that's so key as Christians, because we are called to be different. We are set apart from the rest of the world. And how our actions are open to everyone. And we just have to be conscious of that and really realize what people are seeing when we are interacting with each other on our daily lives. It doesn't mean that we need to be perfect, because there's no way that we can be perfect, but we always have to be kind of a little bit conscientious of what we're doing on a daily basis as to what we're putting out there for others to see and to witness us doing. So this is really where missional work really comes into play. And I'm so excited to go through the rest of these weeks and chapters, because we get to see how the different ways that we can really show what others are like, and how we enjoy being a Christian, and why they might question why we do the things we do. And so we actually get to see some of this set in the time of the Roman times as well. We talk about and we see during this Roman rule, Christians are really being more involved in ministry during the time of Julian's rule during the Roman Empire. And it's so, so crazy, because this time Jesus is gone, and it's really the disciples that are taking over the ministry and really multiplying disciples all over. And they're living a different life. These Christians are living a very different life from those that are following Roman rule. And this is a problem. It's a huge, huge threat in Julian's eyes. The Roman leaders did not like Christians, because Christians did not believe in the Roman pagan gods. So Julian would constantly refer to Christians as atheists. So if you ever read any of Julian's writings and he refers to atheists, he's basically calling the Christians atheists, because we have a completely different God than what they followed. So he was really, really fearful that Christians were doing all of these different things in the community that was really gaining traction, and people were noticing what the Christians were doing as far as missional work and helping the poor, helping the sick. And Julian didn't like it, because he thought that Christians would eventually take over the Roman Empire. So he was very, very fearful, and this is what he writes. And if you're following along in the book, it's on pages 8 and 9. So he writes that Christians are known as Galileans, or atheists as well. Julian writes, "We must pay special attention to this point, and by this means effect a cure." So it's so interesting that he thinks that Christianity needs to be cured. It's a sickness in his mind. "For when it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the pagan priest, the Roman priests, then I think the impious Galileans," he's talking about the Christians here, "observed this fact, and then devoted themselves to helping the poor. And they have gained ascendancy in the worst of their deeds through the credit they win for such practices. For just as those who entice children with a cake, and by throwing it to them 2 or 3 times, induce them to follow them, and then when they are far away from their friends, cast them on board a ship and sell them as slaves. By the same method, I say, the Galileans also begin with their so-called love feast, or hospitality, or service of tables, for they have many ways of carrying it out, and hence call it by many names. And the result is that they have led very many into atheism, aka Christianity. So this is a huge problem to Julian, because he's noticing that his own leaders, his own priests, are not helping the poor or the sick, but he's seeing these Christians take on a missional attitude towards helping the poor and sick. And then his followers of Roman citizens are seeing these Christians being helpful and showing love, and they're like, hey, what's that all about? We would like to be involved in that. And so he's seeing the Christianity actually increase within his own empire. And that's a huge problem. He wants everyone to follow his religion of these fake pagan gods. And he just can't handle what the Christians are doing so far. And he's calling them atheists, which is so crazy to even think that he's using that terminology to describe Christians. So then he goes on and he says, why do we not observe that it is their benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase this atheism? I believe that we ought really and truly to practice every one of these virtues, for it is disgraceful that when the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. So he is calling the missional work that the Christians were doing fake or pretend caring for these people. And he doesn't like that at all. And he's trying to get his own pagan priests to do some of the work that the Christians are doing and saying, hey, we really should be showing love too. But it wasn't the type of love that the Christians were showing. Julian was only trying to get his priests to act in order for his followers, the amount of followers, to remain the same. So, kind of interesting. He's noticing that his Roman followers are quickly turning over to Christianity. So definitely look over on pages really 8 through 10, because we get to see what Julian's social plight is with the Christians, and it is very detailed. So very interesting with his type of rule. So what does this really mean for us today? What is our goal for our time? Well, really, the writer talks about that we need to be propelled outward into the lives of our neighbors. But we also need to be propelled upward into a deeper intimacy with our relationship with Jesus. Okay? So our goal is to be outward in our community, but upward with our relationship in Christ. So that's our big takeaway from this chapter. So there's a few questions for us to talk about. The first one is, in what ways do you personally share your God story? How do you share your faith with others? Or better yet, have you ever? Because I know that there's quite a few of us Christians that have never done that. We're too afraid sometimes to share our God stories. There was a very large Bible study that I was leading years and years ago, and we were talking about God stories. And one of the questions was, who has a God story? And nobody raised their hand. And they really did not think that their experience with being a Christian was a God story or was a very valuable God story. And that was kind of interesting to see that. And we have to realize that no matter what our stories are, because trust me, my story is very different from yours, and it should be, but all of our stories are equally valuable. Equally valuable. And so I invite you to have those situations where you can freely share your God story with others, because you just never know what that person is going to take away from your God story. You might think that your own personal experience is not special, but I'm telling you that it is. It is very special. And we all have that opportunity to be this quote unquote evangelist by sharing our own stories with people. That's what missional being is. That's what evangelism is. It's a hard word to say, by the way, evangelism. so, so ask yourself, have you ever had the opportunity to do so? And would you feel comfortable doing it? So, one thing that you can do to get yourself more comfortable to sharing your God story is to share it with your spouse. Share it with your kids, especially your kids, because they need to know why mom or dad are Christians. Well, Mom, why are we a Christian? Why do we go to church? Why is it important? What a perfect opportunity to share your God story with your child, and so that they too can understand why it's so important to be a Christian. And hopefully, that being a Christian can become such a very long generational pattern within your own family. So I would start there. Then also reflect on the rhythms of your life. So, what does that mean? Well, what are the things that we do on sort of a regular basis that is only derived from our faith? So, do you go to a Christmas service every year? Do you go to an Easter service every year? Or do you go to church monthly or weekly? You know, what are the things that you do? I know that I have quite a few friends that love to work at the food banquet in Sioux Falls. And they have such a fun time. In fact, most of them go back monthly and they volunteer. They have to get up really, really early. I've done that a few times, and trust me, it is really early. It's like 4 in the morning. So, but it's fun. It is so much fun to be able to share your missional work and help those that are in need. And that's a really great way to do that. So what are some of the things that you do that are because that you are a Christian? What are those things? And why are they important to you? And can you encourage your own children or your friends or your family to take on that missional work with you? I think as Christians, you know, our goal is to be Christian minded in our community and to spread that Christian love towards others so that they also want to join the Christian community as well. And we can really invite others to participate with us. So, do you consider yourself a gift evangelist, like a pastor, somebody that is called to do bold proclamation of the gospel? Or are you more of an evangelistic believer where you are prayerful, where you are watchful, where you are more likely to share your God story with someone? So, which type of evangelist are you? I know that for me, myself, I kind of find myself right in the middle of both. So, I don't have that bold stand on a corner and shout from the heavens, shout to the heavens the gospel, but I kind of have more of a leadership role, being a pastor, but I definitely lean towards a little bit more of really relating to people on a believer type level. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. So, because I think you can be just as impactful sharing your God story as you are being the person shouting to the rooftops who Jesus is, who God is, and going that route too. So we all are called to use our gifts differently, and they are all valuable, all. So you might think, you know, I'm really not doing anything, but I bet you are. I bet you are, and you're not even realizing it, because it can be so subtle, but the impact can still be huge, huge. So just kind of this week, ask yourself, well, what are the things that I'm doing that is really telling others that I'm a Christian? And what can I do to tell people that I'm a Christian and why I'm a Christian? So who this week can you share your God story with? Is it your kids? Is it a friend? Is it a neighbor? Is it a coworker? Half the time, our coworkers, they get to know us on a very deep level, and so sometimes religion and Christianity comes up. So don't be afraid to share that with those that are asking questions. But so those are kind of my thoughts with this first chapter, and I'm so excited to see what the next few chapters, these few weeks are going to be, and it leads us right up into Easter. So we're going to be in this book for a while. So it is Surprise the World by Michael Frost. And again, you can find it on Amazon or Cokesbury.com. And it's very inexpensive. It's a very quick read, too. So the chapters are pretty short. And at the end, there's a whole bunch of questions that you can ask yourself. And if you want to do it as a family type study, too, I mean, what a better way to sit around and ask your family these questions at the end of the book and get to have these really interesting conversations within your own home. So, well, I'm going to leave it there, and I will see you all next week. And don't forget to like us on Facebook and find us on YouTube and subscribe so that you never miss one of our episodes here. And just have a great rest of your week. So, thank you.